Good morning, CHD. Welcome to the program. I have a guest whose work I find intensely interesting. His name is Patrick Wood. He has the Technocracy News website and email list, and if you're not on it, I would suggest you please go to Technocracy News and find what he has to offer. He provides 4 articles a day. He sometimes recycles them, but there's always at least one new one of great interest. Now, Pat has had many careers, but I'm most interested in his career as a historian of technocracy, both the technocracy of 90 years ago and the technocracy of today. But I'm going to let him tell you all of his history, if he would, and then I'll start asking him questions.
You know, I'm the old guy in the room, right? Because I've been studying this globalization for 48 years now. That's a long time. Much of the stuff that happened in the 70s, of course, I was an eyewitness to those things. I can speak with authority. But nevertheless, I wrote 2 books back in the 70s with Professor Anthony Sutton, and they were called Trilaterals over Washington. That was the de facto standard of research on that organization called the Trilateral Commission that was founded by David Rockefeller and Brzezinski in 1973. This is where modern globalization started, in my opinion, and I think it's defensible. There were lots of stuff happened before that. True, it all pointed to this, but they realized at that point they weren't getting the job done, and so they tried to do something new. That's why.
And when you say they weren't getting the job done, what was the job?
Well, the job was to create a new world order, simply to erase nation states, to knit the world together through the United Nations, etc. It wasn't working for them. They understood that back then, and that's why Rockefeller came up with this catchphrase called the New International Economic Order. That was all over the literature back then. We didn't really understand what that meant at the time. I mean, who knew?
Right. Okay, so this is 1973 when the Trilateral Commission was founded. Was it the same year that he came up with this moniker?
Yes, exactly. The same. They started out of the gate with that phrase. It was all over the literature. Interestingly, Meryl, in 1974, the United Nations passed a general resolution. I think it was 3208, if I'm not mistaken. I might be on that, but it said that the resolution title was "The Establishment of a New International Economic Order."
Yes.
They handed it off to the United Nations almost immediately. That was like 9 months after the commission was founded. So that's where the United Nations got involved with this from the get-go as well. That eventually morphed into Agenda 21 and all the things that brought with it, and Agenda 2030. The concept of sustainable development, where resource management was envisioned, and that was the contagion that Rockefeller knew would work for him, because Rockefeller was not global at that point. He had to have a global contagion to take this nonsense to the world, and he did, and
So
it has.
let's go back even before that. So in the 1930s, this sort of science fiction idea of technocracy, that the world could have a dictatorship run by scientists that would go on forever, came about. And it was really just like a sci-fi novel, but it
Yes,
became an academic enterprise for a brief period. And
it
you
did.
are a chronicler of this.
It's science fiction. Odd you should mention it. The book Brave New World, written by Aldous Huxley in 1932, same year that technocracy was at Columbia University. He saw into the heart of technocracy. He said, "I'm going to write a book about this," and it was basically a utopian system that had no political system whatsoever, that was run by technocrats, scientists, and engineers who were trained to do just that thing, to make all the decisions about how everything is going to run in the world. And even to this day, people don't understand where that book came from or what it was writing about in that day. But we use this phrase today, "Brave New World," isn't it? So
Yes,
that
exactly.
that's right.
And
That's where the phrase came from. Was from this book that was looking into technocracy at that time.
And then about 15 years later, we have the other book.
1984. Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
Yeah,
1984.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Orwell certainly understood technocracy as well. However, he spun it through the lens of pain versus reward. In 1984, you had a shock immediately. Was if you did something bad, you're going to get nailed for it. But in A Brave New World, when stress came upon you, you would take your pill, the Soma, it was called back. Remember Soma, but now it's Soma too, right? It was Soma, and that day, just pop a few of those pills, you feeling really good all of a sudden, and all your concerns would be melted away, so to speak. That's how they controlled everybody in Brave New World. And it's interesting today, we have a drug called Soma that's very similar in action and purpose.
So anyway, so in the 1930s, there was an academic discipline briefly of technocracy that was respectable, and then it turned out that the main proponent was a fraud, um, had faked his degrees, and so it fell out of favor. But it got picked up again later in the 1970s. Now, in the middle of that, I believe he was the uncle of David Rockefeller, John Rockefeller the Jr., who donated the land for the UN. So
That's
was
right.
very involved with the formation of the UN.
Yes.
And as I read the enabling documents of the UN and the WHO, I wonder if there weren't some technocrats there at that time helping to create those documents with a plan to use these organizations as a mechanism for gaining, supranational control,
Yes.
another form of governance outside of nation states that
Yeah.
would knit the world together in the same way.
Yes.
Have you come across that?
Absolutely. I think that's a defensible idea. Um, the movement fell out of favor, mostly, well, not totally, but something happened with Howard Scott for sure. He was a huge embarrassment to Columbia University, and Columbia threw all of them out at that point, except for the professors and the scientists who were tenured at Columbia. They stayed on, but they were forbidden to talk about technocracy from that day forward. They could not even mention it for losing their scholarship or position. that probably set their plans back a little bit, my guess, because there was no money that came to them at that point. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, all these foundations and so on, they didn't give them any money at that point. So as a discredited movement, if you will, nobody would touch them with a 10-foot stick at that point. However, when Zbigniew Brzezinski, was at Columbia University in the 60s. Get this connection here, Columbia University. Okay, he was at the same place, right, where it started.
Right.
He wrote a book called Between Two Ages: America's Role in the Technotronic Era. I didn't understand that title back then. I do now, because when I discovered historic technocracy, oh, I get it. He couldn't say the word technocracy because he would have been fired. But he wrote about this coming technotronic era that we see ourselves in now. That was the basis for this new international economic order that Rockefeller got it. He really saw the potential. Now, it's interesting.
Exactly. So Rockefeller read his paper and then hired Brzezinski. Is
That's
that
right.
right?
That's right. He not just hired him, he brought him on as a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. He was a strategist from the get-go. That was his value to that partnership, because Rockefeller didn't have the brains to do that. He just had the money. He didn't have the brains.
Yeah. Well,
But
no, I think David Rockefeller was very smart, but, and he was a strategist in many ways.
exactly. But in any case, we see Brzezinski fulfilling his role as the co-founder and also the chief architect of the Carter administration, where he admitted later he was the one that picked Carter and Mondale. Both were members of the Trilateral Commission. He became the first national security advisor as well. That's the first appointment Carter did. And then he proceeded to get all but one member of the cabinet chosen from the Trilateral Commission. It was a clean sweep at that point. It's absolutely amazing thing that happened back then. That's why we got excited about this. You can't do that. If it was the Boy Scouts, we would have flipped a wig. It doesn't matter what group you're from. You just can't stack the deck like that with your members. But they didn't think anything about it. Obviously, they had a mission in mind.
And what was that mission?
Well, the mission was to create a new international economic order. Let me explain. They said all the time back then, and that they weren't interested in politics. They said that. We disputed that with them back then. I thought, you guys, don't give me that line, But they were not interested in politics per se. What they wanted to do was get a hold of the economic machinery of the United States. The positions like the U.S. Trade Representative, the Secretary of State, all the economic positions, right? Like the Secretary of the Treasury, et cetera, and the World Bank. That's what they were after, was to get their hands on the engine of economic prosperity for the world, and they did
Okay,
it.
so let me stop you again.
Yes,
Let's go back. So the UN was founded in 1945. It had been negotiated with 29 countries for 4 years before that. So throughout the U.S. participation in World War II, we were already talking about a UN and
yes,
planning how to use it strategically to assert our developing international authority.
yes,
The World Bank and the IMF were both formed in 1944. Right before that, in New Hampshire, at Bretton Woods, a
yes,
little town with a fancy hotel. Um, and the WHO was formed in 1948. The Bank of International Settlements was formed earlier in 1930 for the purpose initially of dealing with reparations from World War One.
Yes.
All right. So I'm putting things into chronologic order. Now we're up to the Carter administration, which was 1977 to 1981. He only had one term. Carter seemed like a nice guy. Somehow he was a peanut farmer from Georgia. He'd been in naval intelligence before that. Somehow he rose up and became president. Nobody even knew who he was.
Yes.
Um, and he seemed like a nice guy, but he was overwhelmed. He was outplayed. I like to think he was a nice guy. Who knows? But certainly his presidency was controlled by globalists, and this sort of began the snowball going down the hill in the United States in terms of getting rid of tariffs, opening up markets around the world, and breaking down borders between countries.
Exactly. One other word that they used a lot back in that day was interdependence. They said we're going to be an interdependent world. That wasn't happening back then, but they said for sure this is where it's going to go, and then they made it happen. So there was no call for interdependence at that point. The nation states of the world were doing just fine, but
And
they
let me
wanted,
say this also: the actual wealth of Americans, the income of Americans in real money was probably the highest it had ever been, and it's gone
yes,
down since in
exactly,
1976 at the
exactly,
beginning of the Carter administration. And that's when one husband could go to work and support a family. And my parents,
yes,
my dad was a chemist. He wasn't making a huge amount of money, but my mom didn't work. We had two cars. They sent us for ballet lessons. So it was the American dream on one income, basically.
yes, yes, exactly. That all changed. Now we know. But the idea, and by the way, all of the economic charts that you can look at from 1973 to today, they all go in one direction. Basically, the loss of wealth, the loss of the middle class, the loss of home ownership, everything that has been against the middle class in America started right then. We see it. The farms, for instance, the tack on farms has been legendary from 1976 at least. There's been so thousands and thousands of family farms have been driven out of existence. I know I was one of those people, my family especially. We got the brunt of it, and we see this attack still happening today. You see that the consolidation of major industries like press, the media, uh, food, et cetera, banking, et cetera. All the consolidation has put money into their coffers. The wealth goes into their coffers and out of ours.
And so, how do you make that happen and people not notice? You create a new ideology, and the new ideology was environmentalism.
Yes,
So, Earth Day was created. I think the first Earth Day was 1970,
yes,
and habitats. Um, The UN had three different habitat meetings starting in 76. There was a Stockholm summit. And I don't remember the name of that one, but in 72, there was a summit in Stockholm that had something to do with environmental things. And
yes,
then in 92, now we've got the Rio Earth Summit, which is a big one, and everyone now, the whole world, these are UN meetings.
yes,
The whole world has to go along with the environmental agenda, and what became sustainable development, and then sustainable development goals.
yes, exactly. It's interesting to note that the doctrine of sustainable development was created by a lady by the name of Gru Harlem Brundtland. She chaired the Brundtland Commission at the request of the UN from 85 to 87 or 88.
Yeah, I think
Um,
83 to 87.
yeah. And the book that she produced out of that commission was called Our Common Future. She later was hailed as the mother of sustainable development, period. That everything they got out of that book just went right into Agenda 21, all of it. Interestingly, she was a member of the Trilateral Commission. You can't make this up.
You,
She,
and not only that, she has been pushing this globalist agenda at a
yes,
very high level for ever since. So she has been involved,
yes,
with the this whole biosecurity agenda
yes,
most recently.
yes.
She used to be one of my heroes because she was a woman doctor,
I know. Yeah.
and she became the prime minister of Norway.
Yes.
Of course, Norway is very important because they have the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, which, if you can control the prime minister of Norway, you can get them to donate lots of money to your pet projects.
Yes.
And then she became the head of the World Health Organization for 5 years, brought in major changes to the international health regulations, which back in 2003 to 2005, which led up to what's going on at the WHO now. So yeah, this woman has had quite a career. They
Yes.
thought they were sending her from Norway to clean up the WHO, and boy, did she get it dirty, even more dirty.
Exactly. So you have to ask the question in any case that did she write all of that stuff that became sustainable development? Did she write that as a human concerned about environmental issues, or did she write it for the sake of the Trilateral Commission policy? I would suggest absolutely positively she made it that this was an expression of Trilateral Commission policy from the get-go.
Yeah, right. You have to clothe everything in
Yes,
beautiful language if you're going to get people to go along. And the
exactly.
Americans and people elsewhere have really, most of them have no idea that they have been losing ground economically for 50 years. 50
Mhm.
years. It's extraordinary. We're not, we should be out in the streets. Our incomes are so much in terms of well, certain products have become cheaper, like clothing and food in that time, but certain products like an education and a house have not. So, well, you're the economist, not me. I'm just the doctor.
You get it. I mean, you don't have to be an economist to see what happened. Uh, yeah, everybody's sweating right now. We've become like the proverbial frog in a pan, where the temperature was raised so slightly over time that we see ourselves boiling in hot water, about to expire economically. And everybody looks around and says, how did this happen? How did this happen? Well, somebody's hand was on the burner, for one thing, and somebody prepared the pot for us to be stewing in as well. We just didn't see it coming.
Yes.
Most people just did not see it coming.
No, I certainly didn't. Another thing we should mention is, along the way, who was the mentee of Brzezinski? It was Obama. And Brzezinski's daughter, Mika, is on television, spreading her
Yes.
narratives.
Yes.
Um, he has a son doing something too, but I've forgotten what it is.
You really appreciate this. Mark Brzezinski, the son, he had a daughter and a son, right? Mark Brzezinski is the ambassador. And by the way, he's a member of the Trilateral Commission,
Of
number one.
course.
He made it in on his own right. He's the ambassador to Poland right now.
Uh,
Just look what's happening in Poland right now. I don't want to get into it. Honestly, I don't. The whole flavor of Ukraine just doesn't. I don't like it at all. But here you have another member of the Trilateral Commission in a strategic position as ambassador to one of probably the most important other country outside of Ukraine in Europe, and he's
in terms of the war,
Well,
in terms of the Ukraine war. Yes,
yes,
exactly. Because Poland is the staging ground for,
yes. And
yeah.
by the way, just this week, Ukraine uh, said that Poland is now going to shoot down drones over Ukrainian airspace.
Mm,
This has involved them now in the war directly. If they shoot down the first plane or drone over, they of course they can shoot one out in their own country, but they're going to
right.
shoot them in out of the sky in Ukraine now. So okay, the beat goes on. It's like,
Exactly. So what, yeah, what you just said is that's basically getting them into the war if they
yes,
shoot down drones over Ukraine's airspace.
if Zbigniew Brzezinski was alive today, by the way, he was from Poland, first place, so they know that territory very well. But if Brzezinski was here today and he was in Poland today, he would be executing the same policy that his son is doing now, Mark, because he always wanted to set a trap for Russia to
Yes.
to fall into the
He
pit,
set
basically.
many traps, you know,
Yes,
Dagestan, all the stands. Yes, Brzezinski, I believe, was the brains behind all of this Muslim fundamentalism that,
absolutely.
uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, probably caused millions of lives to be lost. So, all right, let's go back. Now we're at 1992. We've got Agenda 21. We've got the Rio Earth Summit. Then we've got Habitat 2. These are all UN meetings in 96.
Yes.
Development of Millennium Development Goals in 2000. And then we move to the key year of 2015. And what is happening then?
Wow. Well, we have, for one, we have the probably most important thing was the climate summit in Paris that all the nations of the world flocked to, and including our president and everybody else. I guess this thought that was a great thing that happened to to sign this treaty that they proposed. Yeah, it wasn't really a treaty. For
Well,
everybody else was a treaty, but not us.
no, what was in the Paris Climate Agreement?
The nations of the world were going to cut back on all emissions, for one thing, to make a war against fossil fuels. They set targets for pollution. Well, not just pollution, not just like what we think is smog or something like that. That wasn't really the issue. They wanted to do away with greenhouse gases in particular, and within that, CO2 as well. They want to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It was crazy, uh, half-baked ideas that came out of that. When I look at that whole mess, I saw the people who orchestrated the policy who went into it. It wasn't a broad-based consortium of people, hardly. They the UN convened a special, what it was called, a
Eminent
committee on,
persons.
or something like that.
Yes,
But
it was a crazy name.
I know,
It
but
really did say a high level group of, and they use that term high level all the time
yes, I
in the
know.
UN.
So,
Um,
but
here
here's
it is. High
okay.
level panel of eminent persons on the post 2015 development agenda.
Oh my gosh. If you had a business card, would you put on it? Yeah, I know. Oh, but here's, when you look at where did the doctrine come from? It came from this panel of people who were mucky mucks in most countries, but the strong man that contributed as much policy to the whole thing was John Podesta. John Podesta has been a snake in the woodpile for decades now. He was a member of the Trilateral Commission as well. And he's been pushing, starting with Clinton administration, he's been pushing, in fact, he's been the chief architect of the Green New Deal, the climate movement in America. He's primarily the major architect of our issues. And here's a guy who is setting the agenda for that meeting. And
Let's remind people who he is. This is a guy who was named in Hillary's emails that Julian Assange released. He also is a major influence on Center for American
yes,
Progress. Yes.
Center for American Progress.
So he's
Yeah,
been that. He was, a close advisor to Obama. Um, he's an unsavory person who
yes,
has pushed the climate agenda. He has been central to the climate agenda for 30 years.
exactly. He's been there, done that. And he's been the face behind the faces that are promoting this stuff. He seldom comes into the public view. He's just kind of a boring guy, I guess, but he doesn't catch headlines.
Okay, so we're in 2015. So we've got not only the Paris Accord. Okay, so the Paris Accord comes along. 20 some people decide what it's going to look like. They then present it at a UN meeting and don't allow any of the nations to make any changes. They get the entire UN, which is now 193 countries, to sort of go along. It's essentially a treaty. The United States tends to treat treaties a little differently than some other countries. We want everybody else to be obliged to follow them, but we like to create a little way out for ourselves. So it was not, it was called an agreement, an executive agreement. Obama signed it without Congress ratifying it. So it wasn't an official treaty, but an executive agreement is kind of like a junior treaty. And the United States was obligated to follow these benchmarks
Yes,
for
yeah,
how much carbon it has to get rid of, how much greenhouse gas, et cetera. And you know more about that than I, so.
exactly. Let me just comment on how that agreement was signed, by the way. The agreement where the treaty would not come into force until a certain percentage of the world signed it. That was a trigger. They call it a trigger, that if everybody didn't sign it, then it would just fall flat. But they had, and I don't remember what it was, how the percentage was, but how we got into it. We're the ones, Obama in particular, got us into the agreement by being the one who tripped the trigger to make it binding for everybody else. That makes sense? And he did it by signing that agreement in the presence of the chairman of the CCP in China. That's where the ceremony took place. He signed it at the same time that the Chinese did, and it became the force of law for the world at that point. The American people had no clue at the beginning that what's he doing in China? Again, you can't make this stuff up. He went over there to do a dirty deed to push the whole thing into existence and force majeure around the world. Everybody else at that point was obligated when he put his signature on. Just amazing.
Yeah, the way the U.S., as I said, works its treaties is interesting. I learned a lot
Yes.
while I was working on the WHO. In fact, there is a bill in Congress that is going to be discussed in committee tomorrow in Michael McCall's committee that would, if this bill goes forward and we strongly support it, and we urge everybody to call their member of Congress and tell them we want this bill. It's House H.R. 1425, which requires that the Senate has to ratify the two WHO treaties. So if they go forward and we have uh, the IHR, certain amendments, much less than what they wanted, but certain
Yes.
amendments have been made to the international health regulations, and the United States government under Biden does not want to put that in front of the Senate. There's also a pandemic treaty that they couldn't come to agreement on, so they agreed to work on it for another year. That too had many names, but they finally settled on the name agreement so that it would look like it didn't have to go in front of the Senate
Yes.
either, which is what they
Yes.
did with the Paris Agreement. And anyway, so this bill 1425 would require both of these two WHO treaties. They're really treaties, they're international agreements that require us to do things, to go before the Senate, where it would have to be ratified by a two-thirds vote, and will not be, because
Yes.
49 Republican senators have already said no, to on paper. So it's very important that we pay attention to these treaties because they can just be signed off somewhere. There's no media. There was very, very little media, if
Exactly.
any, about the WHO, even though these treaties were being negotiated for 2 years. And then they got dealt with the final week of May of this year. So anyway, that is exactly what happened with this Paris Climate Agreement and with several of these other agreements. The leaders of the world figured out how to get around national governments.
Yes.
That they captured the UN, they captured the WHO, they provide a lot of the funding, they provide the experts, they provide the committee members, and
Yes.
they create other organizational structures that allow them to rule various things without governments. And so anyway, so also in 2015 there was the transformative economic. Cristina Figueres decided that we needed to transform our entire economic development model.
Yes.
And then in Habitat 3, and a few months later, there was the new urban agenda
Mhm.
and claims that in the future, cities would replace nation states. City
Yes.
states, cit-
Yes.
cities and their surroundings would replace nations. And that is one mechanism by which you get around national governments and national laws. You let the
Exactly.
cities make their own rules, and you have, of course, your people in charge. Um, and they aren't voted in. They're appointed.
That's right. Again, you can't make this stuff up. We can reflect back on how this business of agreement, like not a treaty, but agreement into existence was back in 1974 when the Office of U.S. Trade Representative was created in the first place. That was at, at the behest of the Rockefellers back then to get this new system in place so the USTR could go out and negotiate for the president without any fanfare. So the threshold was lowered from 2/3 to 50%, just a simple majority at that point. That's all it needs to clear. And that has caused us all of this trouble ever since, because treaties before that 1974 were always ratified by a two-thirds vote for this from the Senate, and that was just fine. We did a lot of treaties over the years. They participated, but I have to say that you'll see this shining through. The technocrats, the technocrat crowd hates government. They want no part of government. If they could wipe it off the face of the planet, they would, to get rid of all politicians everywhere, laws, whatever, and just let them execute what they want to do according to their own rule of law. George
So I
Bush,
have
by
to
the way,
disagree. Yeah, I have to disagree with you a little bit because as I studied treaties, it turns out that we are party to thousands, and that the majority of them, even from the 1700s, the, ma-
yes,
well, even then, we did not put all of them in front of the Senate. So
you're right there. Yeah,
many of them just executive agreements, and and the Congress didn't complain. If there was a big one, Congress wanted to see it,
Yeah,
but for most of them, and nowadays it's less than 2% actually go in front of the Senate for its
yes,
advice and consent.
exactly. Yeah.
And you're
Right, by the way. Congress uh, failed their duty all these years. They should have paid attention to every single one. They didn't.
and why do we want governments? I mean, a lot of us, think that we'd be better off if we're libertarians without a lot of government
I
interference.
know. I know.
However, what a government gives you is elections. They're not always fair. I think if we go back to paper ballots, we might be able to make them fair. But it also gives you accountability. When you have these elected officials or where you have technocrats just moving into positions of power, there's nothing you can do to get rid of them, to change them. You can't vote them out.
That's right.
And that's the basic problem. And that's why the technocrats, the globalists, the people who really would like to have more power, more authority, and more control of resources around the world, they don't care what party you are. Parties mean nothing to them. Parties are like bread and circuses. They're like sports teams. They entertain us, while these people, work behind the scenes to get what they want done regardless, and they pay off both parties.
Exactly.
So let's go to public-private partnerships.
Oh boy.
Um, Tell us how they came into being, and what are they?
Well, again, here you have a construct that originated originally in the bowels of the United Nations, where they came up with the idea, wouldn't it be nice if you could get some private companies kind of come along inside of government entities to partner, to bring money to the table, basically, to partner with a public entity to do infrastructure projects, perhaps, or some other project that needs to be done, but you don't have the money for it, or whatever. Get somebody else who can do it, execute it for you, come in a partnership with them. And this is everywhere now. This language is everywhere in the world, and you see it at the United Nations all the time. Public-private partnerships. These are the scourge of both government and economics, because it sets up a partnership where the government almost always loses big time. Somehow,
And the government means us, the taxpayers.
yes, that's
We
right.
lose because the government is giving away our money or other goodies, like we won't tax you, or we will give you a piece of public land, or something else. The government is chipping in, gets a
Yeah,
company to invest, but then the companies aren't going to invest if they could do better by themselves. If they didn't need the government, right? They can invest, they can build a company without the government. But if
that's
they go into it, they expect they're going to get something more than if they did it themselves. And so they make a deal. If, as you pointed out in your book, if the deal goes sour, the company gets out and the taxpayer is saddled with cleaning up or
yes,
dealing with it, or the fact that now 5,000 people don't have a job. Um, on the other hand, if the deal goes well, then the taxpayers have lost because their government has given up something to this public-private partnership, and the government generally does not have a controlling interest. So it is the private sector that makes the decisions about what happens. And as you said, these are everywhere. So almost any
mm,
company that wants to, if you want to expand out, you say, look, what are you guys going to give me? Which state is going to give me a piece of land or a really good tax break? And so I'm very familiar with the Jackson Lab near where I live. I used to work there as a doctor briefly. When they wanted to expand, they didn't just go buy a piece of land and build. No, who's going to give me, which city, which state is going to give me the best deal? And that's what they went for. Same with the anthrax vaccine manufacturer. They
yeah,
required a very good deal before they're going to put down any money. And that the locals, get harmed. The local people lose almost invariably with these deals. But now this is the model. So all around the world, everything is public-private partnerships. So the idea is to dismantle sovereignty, which means, again, chipping away, getting more and more of the power of government that these corporations can't control away from them into cities or into regional districts or into public-private partnerships. Tell us a bit about that. The smart cities, the smart regions, and what else is being formed to actually create new systems of governance without voting, without accountability?
I know, most the Agenda 21/2030 agenda has been implemented in America, uh, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly through city organizations. That, in other words, agencies that target cities. They've done this mostly with a scheme of regional government that is
So who targets
unconstitutional.
the city? Who comes
Yes,
in and says, "We're gonna give you a deal"?
that's right. And they kind of stuck in with transportation issues because cities have to, if they're neighboring, they have to have some coordination, cities, streets, stuff like that, maybe mass transportation sort of thing. But these organizations called COGS, Councils of Governments, they're everywhere in America now, except 2 states, I think, does not have any of these. But they're exercising all this authority, uh, assumed authority on their part. Nobody asked them to do it, but they just assumed it. They're all
Well,
NGOs
no,
by
wait. No, somebody came in and said, "You can do this, and it's gonna be good for you, and even we're gonna give you money if you do it."
what.
So who came in with that idea?
Well, the cities, of course, have been begging for money forever, and unfortunately, this COGS network somehow got between the money that's redistributed from the federal government down to cities for highway taxes and stuff like that. This has always been the case where a city wanted to build a bridge or do some project, whatever, they'd always go to the government transportation department to just get a grant from them. It's basically returning money that's already spent from taxes that have been put in. Well, this COGS network somehow got a hold of that money, and they're the ones that parceling out to all cities now around the country. And when they say to a city, well, we're going to give you this money for this project, but you have to do these other they call them conditionalities. You have to do these other things for us too. You have to get this zoning thing happen, created here, this another building standards or building codes or whatever. You need to implement that. And so they say you need to do all this other stuff. Then we'll let you have your money. This total it drives cities
Right.
crazy at this
So
point.
I had a hard time understanding how this even happened, but let me reiterate what you said. So somehow you've got either a city, which is going to become a smart city, or you've got this council of governance, which is maybe a few cities or a county or a few counties, and they can get money that doesn't come directly from the state or directly, or the city can get money that doesn't come directly from the state or the federal government, but the money from the state and federal government goes to these now institutions that have inserted themselves between the town, the city, and the federal and state government, and you have to get the money from them. And then in order to get that money, you have to meet other conditionalities. You have to
Yes.
meet conditions. And you suddenly have signed up as a smart city, and your mayor thinks he is a champion. He has signed you up. You're so lucky. And now you're going to get $40 million and everything, and we're going to be green. Everything's going to be green. We're not going to have any emissions. We're not going to have any pollution, and there's going to be cameras everywhere, so there won't be any crime. And we're going to collect all your data, and everyone will be happy forever.
You got it. You got the big picture. This is this is just not good. You know, that this whole business, the whole system of these COGS organizations, um, they're all NGOs. They're not government organizations at all. They're controlled by super NGOs at the top of the pyramid. But you can't look at them and say, well, where do you get your authority from? I mean, you know, are you actually a government, or are you assigned to the State Department or Department of Transportation or something? No, we're not. But it's so aggravating. You can't understand how evil this is from America's point of view. That these people could somehow get a lever on our money for our cities to steer us where they want to steer us. This is why we have all of this smart city nonsense everywhere now. It's mostly coming from these COGS organizations and the League of National League of Cities, the National League of Counties, the National League of Governors, especially. All these organizations are not, they're NGOs, period. They just somebody set them up as a nonprofit to say, this is a good thing. We'll kind of get all those governors lined up in there and let them, give them a place to go talk and stuff. Well, then the hammer came down. All these organizations now are basically telling us to do what to do on the ground, here and in our cities, and we can't get rid of them now. You just can't bust these people.
Yes. So I hope the audience has gotten a taste of what's happening to us and why, and what is this sort of deep infrastructure that has been created. This is the book. This is an amazing book. Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order, that Patrick Wood has written. It's not very thick. It's easy to read in an afternoon, and this will tell you the history that we've been discussing. And if more people understand this, we can turn it around.
Absolutely, I agree with that for sure. By the way, there's an audiobook available and a Kindle version as well. If people don't like to get a book in their hand, I do. I like books. I'm a sucker for books, actually. But if you can't get the book, then do the Kindle, do the audiobook. If you listen in a car, or drive to work or something, you'll get the information either way.
Thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate this, and I hope we'll get to talk again soon.
Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate it too.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.